Hello, and welcome to part 4 of our Varys and Illyrio series, where we take a look at two of the most important schemers and power players in the A Song of Ice and Fire series. So by now, we've done a little diving into these guys, and whether or not you see things the way I do, I've tried to put forth the image of Varys and Illyrio that I see as forming in the material we have so far. And at this point, you know that I suspect that Varys and Illyrio are working for the Blackfire cause, that Varys himself, along with young Griff, are very likely Blackfires, almost certainly in the case of young Griff, and that Varys is likely staging and manipulating all of this political power play as a performance potentially for Bloodraven, the arch-nemesis of House Blackfire. But before we build into our final thoughts, I'd like us to take a look at the often considered junior partner in the affair, Illyrio Mopatis. After all, every good play has a producer.
And I just want to wish everybody good luck.
And while he is often not as considered, no doubt the producer of this performance has some skills that are worth taking note of.
I came up, got my name up, so when they speak of who blinged up, I'm who they bring up. Come up dissing and you'll come up missing. I'm a cutthroat baller like O.J. Simpson. Little homie, listen, try and serve me. I put a 25 in your back like Barry Bonds jersey. On the streets, on the beach, y'all ain't able, cause to I shit on rappers like major labels. What's with the ice grilling, homie? Change your face to see they'll do more than 10.
So, what do we know about this guy? What do we know about Illyrio Mopatis? Well, Tyrion spends a decent chunk of time with him in A Dance with Dragons, so we get a little bit of information from him. However, this is rather dubious, and I'm not sure if we can exactly trust everything he's saying. But let's take a look at an expanded version of a conversation we peeked at earlier in the series. Are you quite certain that Daenerys will make good her brother's promises? She will, or she will not. Illyrio bit the egg in half. I told you, my little friend, not all that a man does is done for gain. Believe as you wish, but even fat old fools like me have friends and debts of affection to repay. Liar, thought Tyrion. There's something in this venture worth more to you than coin or castles. You meet so few men who value friendship over gold these days. Too true, the fat man said, deaf to the irony. How is it that the spider became so dear to you? We were young together, two green boys in Pentos. Varys came from Myr. So he did. I met him not long after he arrived, one step ahead of the slavers. By day he slept in the sewers. By night he prowled the rooftops like a cat. I was near as poor, a bravo in soiled silks, living by my blade. Perhaps you chanced to glimpse the statue by my pool? Python Malanon carved it when I was 6 and 10. A lovely thing, though now I weep to see it. Age makes ruins of us all. I'm still mourning for my nose. But Varys? In Myr, he was a prince of thieves, until a rival thief informed on him. In Pentos, his accent mocked him, and once he was known for a eunuch, he was despised and beaten. Why he chose me to protect him, I may never know, but we came to an arrangement. Varys spied on lesser thieves and took their takings. I offered my help to the victims, promising to recover their valuables for a fee. Soon every man who had suffered knew to come to me. Will city's footpads and culprits sought out Varys. Half to slit his throat, the other half to sell him what they'd stolen. We both grew rich, and richer still when Varys trained his mice. In King's Landing he kept little birds. Mice, we called them then. The older thieves were fools, who thought no further than turning a night's plunder into wine. Varys preferred orphan boys and girls. He chose the smallest, the ones who were quickest and quiet, and taught them to climb walls and slip down chimneys. He taught them to read as well. We left the gold and gems for the common thieves. Instead, our mice stole letters, ledgers, charts. Later they would read them and leave them where they lay. Secrets are worth more than silver or sapphires, Varys claimed. Just so, I grew so respectable that a cousin of the Prince of Pentos let me wed his maiden daughter, whilst whispers of a certain eunuch's talents crossed the narrow sea and reached the ears of a certain king, a very anxious king who did not wholly trust his son, nor his wife, nor his hand, a friend of his youth who had grown arrogant and overproud. I do believe you know the rest of this tale? Is that not so?
Much of it, Tyrion admitted.
I see that you are somewhat more than a cheesemonger after all. You are kind to say so, my little friend, and for my part, I see that you are as quick as Lord Varys claimed.
He smiled, showing all his crooked yellow teeth, and shouted for another jar of Mirish fire wine. So, obviously there's a lot going on here, but I think what we can fairly clearly discern is that there is at least some degree, probably a pretty large degree, of bullshitting going on here, which is not uncommon with Varys and Illyrio. He's speaking in half-truths at least half the time. If I had to pick one big takeaway from this little excerpt, it would probably be the interesting way that Illyrio describes the king as having found out about Varys' skills. Like, they just drifted across the water and got to the ear of the king. Yeah, that's not fucking suspicious at all. And that, to me, potentially links us into this whole idea of Varys and Illyrio supporting the Blackfires, as it's kind of showing that they have been planning this for a long time, and that they've taken great pains to even get to Westeros. This also kind of makes me wonder about the chronology surrounding Tywin and King Aerys' falling out. Like, obviously it could have been purely the madness, but we also don't know if Varys had a hand in pushing that over the edge. Many people have pointed out before the interesting contradiction of Illyrio apparently being so poor that he's living by his blade, but somehow having enough money or renown to have statues carved of him. He also clearly wants to tell Tyrion a much more simplified version of the story, and Tyrion hits him with specified details, like, for example, when he knows where Varys allegedly originated from, and this kind of pokes holes in the way Illyrio is attempting to simplify things. But nonetheless, he seems elusive and deflective in a lot of regards here. All in all, Illyrio tries to turn what is otherwise a fascinating and complex backstory that clearly has a very highly directed purpose into a charming tale of two thieves making their way up in the world and stuff. But to me, the general overtones again betray his huge levels of bullshitting. Like, we can suss out little things about his politics by the fact that he owns slaves in a city where slave owning is not cool. But other than it being kind of obvious that Illyrio does wheelin' and dealin', he keeps his wheelin' and dealin' pretty close to the hilt, actually. He's not a great liar, but he's also not just dumping his own personal information that could easily be used against him constantly. He's just doing it sometimes, like with the wife thing. Part of this might be George not wanting to write the intricacies of Illyrio's wheelings and dealings and tradings and schemings and money affairs and yada yada yada, but part of this might also be George being very careful with what he reveals through Illyrio, not wanting to drop too many hints that direct us away from things that guide us towards the Blackfires. I know that might sound kind of strange, but again, if you buy into the Blackfire thing like I do, Illyrio doesn't actually have that much dialogue, and a lot of it is pretty heavily tilted towards revealing certain things in that direction. Finally, I think it's interesting that Illyrio is running a notable scam that everyone is kind of aware of and having to buy into more or less, but he's also able to gain a lot of respect. I actually kind of wonder how much street presence Illyrio had, or even how much of a hand and how much presence he had in the intel community. Selling secrets does kind of get you pinned as a Varys kind of character versus somebody who would rise up the ranks of nobility and be offered prominent marriages, and then become a major trade mogul. Putting the intricacies of how he does it on the daily aside, Illyrio is fabulously wealthy. Like, people often get pretty into Littlefinger in terms of Littlefinger's money manipulation schemes and stuff like that. And while Littlefinger might be a better chef when it comes to cooking the books, Illyrio really is a massive monster when it comes to earning income. Seriously, the man appears to have the GDP of, like, most of Westeros just personally. And in a world where basic local amenities are something the poor can usually rarely come by, Illyrio is absolutely stacked with international goods. We also know that Illyrio very unapologetically engages in the slave trade, something that no doubt has contributed vastly to his fortune building. All this said, Illyrio seems to be a major and vastly important contributor to the cause. After all, Varys has an even more potent personal bank than Littlefinger. So Illyrio, he's rich, he's cunning, he's absolutely horrible, with a sexual appetite for the non-consenting. As you may recall, in Illyrio's manse, no servant dare refuse you. And so it didn't take me long to start thinking that he shared a fair amount of similarities with the Baron Harkonnen. Now I know what you're thinking, the Baron Harkonnen is so much worse and so much more evil and so much yada 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 yada. But are you sure they're not just the same kind of horrible, in different settings? Imagine if you cut the Baron Harkonnen down the middle and split that person into two people, Varys and Illyrio, and then gave them a wild George R. R. Martin backstory that weaved them into the Blackfires and stuff. And well, if you do that, I think that you're getting pretty close to some of the inspiration for Varys and Illyrio. Because while Varys and Illyrio might not be the pure caricature of evil that characterizes the Harkonnens, they are certainly dark and evil in many of the exact same ways, including the ways they manipulate and prey upon the young. They have an appetite for the despicable. And while I think their motivations might have a little more dimension to them, the methodology reveals very sinister people. But I hear you out there, you're saying, random internet guy, come on, is that all you got? Surely you must have a little more if you're bringing up this whole Dune connection, right? Well, actually, in fact, yes, I do. I think there's other little bits of evidence to indicate that partially the Varys and Illyrio plot and the characters themselves may have been inspired by Baron Harkonnen and the Harkonnen plot. Now, I'm not what you'd call a Dune aficionado. I've fallen asleep 3 times at the exact same place in the book, and I fell asleep during the recent motion picture movie at the same time roughly that I fell asleep during the books. That's not to say Dune is boring, it's quite interesting. I just always fall asleep at that part for some reason, and I've never made it over the hill. But I was very proficient at the early 2000s video game Dune, for whatever that counts for. All of that is to say, I'm not going to give you an intricate rundown of Dune, because frankly I can't give you an intricate rundown of Dune. I can, however, point out something rather interesting. If you remember, in part 1 of the series, we put forward the idea that the plan concocted by Varys and Illyrio involved a misrule, a bad war, essentially, waged by likely Viserys, but potentially Daenerys, or the two of them together, that would pave the way for young Griff to come through as the savior. Well, as it turns out, the Baron Harkonnen's plan for his mischievous nephews is to have one of them rule Arrakis as a tyrannical asshole, and basically pave the way for the other one to appear as the savior of the people and planet. Furthermore, there's an interesting thing going on with Paul, the main character, the Atreides kid, and the Baron Harkonnen himself. Paul, who fills a different role than young Griff would be filling in this equation, actually is the Baron Harkonnen's grandson, if I'm getting this correct. And this is kind of a parallel in my mind to Illyrio most likely being young Griff's father. And then to top it all off, another pretty strong connection is that, at least according here to Wikipedia, part of the symbolage and heraldry of House Harkonnen is a griffin. Granted, it's a blue griffin, so George seems to have switched a few things around. I don't think these are meant to be in any way one-to-ones. I think George is doing a lot of inspiration-based things and like homage here. One final thought on Illyrio here, and then we'll close it on out. Illyrio has a lot of wonderful rings and jewelry he's always wearing. And it's been speculated before that these are indicators of who he's linked to in alliances, or perhaps who he's serving. And I wanted to put forward a slightly different take on that. I kind of wonder if these aren't perhaps representation of him having fingers in lots of different pies, or having a hand in lots of different factions, but not really being ruled by those factions. It might indicate who he trades with, who he interacts with, who he's got interests with, and they may be supporting him, but I'm not sure if they're controlling him or if he's working for them. What I do know, though, is whether or not he's portrayed this way in the book, and honestly I can't remember, the Baron Harkonnen is also always drawn blinged out and ringed out. So make of that what you will. So, kind of a short video this time, especially compared to the last one. I didn't have a whole ton to say on Illyrio more than what's being said here, so undoubtedly I missed some stuff. If you guys want to put some questions, comments, thoughts in the comment section down there, that would be great, and I'll try to answer them to the best of my ability. And of course, if you want to drop anything for the post-series Q&A, you can always feel free to do that, just like label it Q&A or something. And with that, we're going to wrap it up, and we'll be heading into our final part in the series, in-game, where we'll talk about some of my rough ideas and thoughts and where I think these various Varis and Illyrio's plots might be going. And then, of course, at some point we'll get around to the supplementary material like I did with the Littlefinger series. There'll be probably 1 or 2 small videos. So, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time.